And I've heard this actually through the week, and so this is really a question for any of the panelists here. But all of you in some way or other mentioned mitigation alternatives, but are we missing the mark? Why aren't we advocating for avoidance to achieve true resilience? And Rob, your comments kind of hit on that a little bit, but what are your perspectives organizationally or from your standpoint of avoidance? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's always cheaper to avoid doing something wrong than paying to clean up a mess later. You know, I think most of us are taught that by our parents from an very early age, right? And then it extends right up through other aspects of our personal and professional lives as we get older. And it's certainly true in the context of flooding and flood insurance, for that matter. That's always been a struggle, I think, for the flood insurance program. You know, I think a lot of people have, fairly or unfairly, said that the flood insurance program really plays a role in incentivizing homeowners to build in risky areas. I don't think that's entirely true. I don't think anybody bought a house in a floodplain and said, you know, I was going to build out of the floodplain, but gosh darn it, this flood insurance is just so darn cheap, I've decided to build in the floodplain. You know, they didn't make it, that's not how the decision was made, but I do believe flood insurance sure plays a role in making it easier for someone to stay there, even once the risk has been brought to their attention. Some of that is because of the way assistance is delivered with an emphasis on rebuilding, but also some of it is there needs to be better mechanisms about how do you get communities to not develop in harm's way so often, and how do you avoid putting things in places that we're going to just have to get them back out of there at some later date. There have been a lot of ideas floated. Jeb Hensarling in the last Congress had a provision for prohibiting new policies in the 100-year floodplain. You know, that would probably have a big effect. That's something that former FEMA administrators like Craig Fugate have also been out there saying that makes a lot of sense, particularly when the 100-year floodplain is, in most places, only getting bigger and more extensive. It's not getting smaller. So anyway, that was a long answer, and it probably just needed to say, yeah, I think we need to do more on avoidance for sure.
Okay, awesome.
So we share a lot in common with NRDC on this point. Mitigating after the fact is really, at least let's not add to the problem, I think is the view of a lot of our members. And I think most of you have probably been in a situation where you have a property built in harm's way, too low, and what are the options at that point? Either you've got potentially unaffordable flood insurance and maybe an inability to sell your home without reducing significantly your listing price, or you're looking at, and I think Susan mentioned, you know, roughly $100,000 retrofit on average. I mean, once it's there, it's too low. There are no good options. What Rob alluded to, the Mitigation Saves study, it was an update. I think most of you are probably familiar with National Institute of Building Sciences, the $1 for every dollar statistic. Well, so part of that study looked at what if we go beyond the 2015 codes, you know, build 2 feet above base flood, you know, freeboard. I mean, I think half the states have a foot above. What if you go beyond, you know, 2 feet? And I think that study concluded that going beyond the 2015 codes for flood risk was somewhere every dollar you spent on going beyond codes, adding that cost to new construction, you save $4 in avoided damage in the future, and that was on average. And I was surprised to see that making those investments continue to be cost beneficial. The benefit continued to exceed the cost up to, I think it was 8 to 10 feet of freeboard above base flood. So, I mean, it seems to me that it's much more cost effective to build stronger up front. At least that's NAR's members' perspective. We support higher building standards and codes in order to try to avoid those sort of difficult situations where a property seller comes to my member as a client and says, wait a minute, you told me you'd be able to sell my home, but now you're telling me that I've got to spend $100,000 in order to retrofit my property. Or, I'm looking at $30,000 flood insurance. How am I going to find a home buyer who's willing to pay this amount? I mean, it's my member who has to explain to that client, manage that client's expectations as to how are they going to get out of that situation. And so they're very interested in avoiding as much as possible any sort of new situation in the future. Now, I will say, I agree completely with the home builders. We've got too many existing properties in harm's way. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, you're much more likely with new construction to withstand a flood than old construction. And so the things that we support on mitigation is we need to make it more efficient. We need to make it quicker. I think Chad's claim to fame is a flood mitigation assistance grant. I can't remember the specifics, but got a mitigation grant for flood repairs from FEMA in 8 months. I mean, think about it, 8 months. You could have rebuilt back with disaster assistance and SBA loans by that time. So if you're a homeowner who's just flooded and you're trying to get back to normal as quickly as you can, and you have this option, either wait, potentially years for a mitigation grant to build back higher, or build back to the old level with, federal assistance. That's a very difficult situation to be in. I mean, I think NAR has been pushing really strongly, use increased cost of compliance, increase the amount that you can get from the NFIP policy to elevate or relocate. Strengthen buyout programs. We agree with NRDC. Let's figure out why these buyout programs take so long and seem to be so efficient. Let's get GAO to study the problem. Let's do what we can in order to improve those mitigations. And I think our members wholeheartedly agree. We need to focus on prevention, proactive reduction of risk rather than the reactive mitigation of risk. And so we need to think about, why is it that for every dollar spent on pre-disaster mitigation assistance, somewhere like $10 is spent on disaster assistance after the fact? I mean, we need to shift and front load those resources up front so that home buyers are able to have the resources that they need in order to build more smartly and more safely.
Okay, great. David or Susan, any comment on that? Sure.
Yeah, just very quickly back to, can't we just avoid? I think the equation is so much more complex than that. It's community economics, it's building economics, it's what do communities want or need, what are the resources available. Everybody saw the pictures after the hurricane in Mexico Beach with the one concrete structure still in place. We can build concrete structures all we want, and those will be resilient, those will be able to withstand these storms, but people can't afford those. And so it's a much more complex, can we avoid areas? Certainly, but the market's going to decide whether or not we do that as builders.
Okay. David?
Yeah, so Chad, as a national program, we don't have the luxury just to focus on one factor. Of course, avoidance would be preferable, and of course that's a decision that's made at the local level, who has land use authority to make those types of decisions. So how do we better integrate what our goals and objectives are with the planning community, with the American Planning Association and others like that? I think there's an increased need and awareness that more should be done in not only just planning for economic purposes, but for planning for making sure that we have a safe community. So the premise is, of course, that communities are going to do what's in their best interests. Sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But yes, we want to encourage avoidance whenever necessary. That's the essence of a definition of mitigation. What steps do we take today to reduce or avoid costs going forward? So yeah, it needs to be a part of an overall strategy on how we reduce disaster costs, how we can make communities more resilient, and how we can reduce disaster suffering.
Chad, just one last thing on that before we move on to the next question. Another key to this is, there's avoiding the risk by never having built there. There's also helping future owners avoid the risk by letting them know what that risk is, and that's something we do a really bad job of in this country, and we can do a much better job, both through flood insurance reforms that give more of the data that FEMA has and private insurers have about existing losses, but we can also make sure that people get information that a previous owner has about, damages that have occurred there. We have to, at some point you have to start breaking the cycle if you're going to avoid these damages. The best thing is to don't start the cycle ever.
I don't think you'll find much disagreement in this room on that. So Austin, one of the things that you had talked about is, the concept of higher standards, and I have several questions up here that are kind of in the same area. The NFIP building and land use standards really have not changed substantially in 50 years, pretty much since the inception of the program. But we know so much more these days. We know, and we see communities and states taking action to adopt things on their own, higher standards, free board, critical facility standards, those kinds of things. And my question for the panel is, what's your, what's your overall impression on the value of higher standards? But more specifically, so many of our members are the ones fighting in the local councils and in the state legislatures for these higher standards, yet we have constituencies, I'll say, and organizations actively opposing them. Given the knowledge that we know, how do we enlist these other organizations to be advocates for higher and wiser standards?
Well, so as I hope people understood, the thrust of what I was trying to communicate this morning is that it takes a movement. There has to be a demand out there for what we're trying to achieve. And so we all need to take I think, a more proactive, one might say aggressive approach to making sure that we have the public sentiment on our side to be able to influence the elected officials or the community leaders. And so that it's not acceptable to lower a standard. So we can continue to try to do things the way that we have done them. I'm just suggesting we have to continue to look for different ways that may be more effective, and that's why we're talking about a movement. It's not going to just happen. We've got to build an army. We've got to really get people to understand this isn't about always just economic aspects. How many times did I mention disaster suffering in my remarks? That's because from my perspective, that's the key here. Americans don't like to see the suffering that exists after event after event after event. So I think, that's just one suggestion on what might work as we try to develop this movement to make fundamental changes in the way we approach how we're affected by disasters regardless of the cause.
Okay. Susan, you actually, can I?
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, you're kind of talking to the wrong guy here. Because we're probably on that other side in most cases, particularly in terms of building codes and standards and things like that. There's a lot of talk now going on about adopting the latest published codes, and right now that would be the ICC, or at least the one that we're focusing on, would be the 2018 version of the ICC. And what a lot of people don't understand about the building codes or don't pay attention to in the building codes is this thought that a newer building code is a better building code. And sure, we could all argue that, but why? What are the provisions in that new building code? Well, if you look at the iterative nature of building codes and how they've changed over time, most of the huge changes related to resiliency, structural integrity, ability to withstand flooding, and so on and so forth, those happened when the codes changed from the legacy codes back in 2000 to the ICC. And so what we found and what FEMA has reported in many instances is anything built since 2000 generally fares pretty well. So sure, we can tinker around the margins, but the changes that generally are being made to the building codes as we speak are things related to things that have nothing to do with resiliency or an ability of a building to withstand storms. They're more related to things like energy efficiency, things like, company X wants to sell more doorbells, so now they got the ICC to include their type of doorbell in the code, and it's not necessarily related to occupant or building or occupant safety.
So I'll probably get this, hopefully I get in the ballpark on this statistic. But I think roughly 66% of the communities across the United States, the only standard they have is the standard that's in place because they became a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program. And I would suggest that's not good enough.
Austin or Rob, any other on this one?
Well, and it also, if you look at the NFIP claims, the history going back to 78, depending on where you start, roughly a quarter to a third of the post-firm construction is making those claims. And because new construction has a higher value, excuse me, attached to it compared with old construction, you see a larger loss on average for the new construction than the old construction. I mean, think about it, it makes sense. If you're going to flood new construction, it's going to be during Harvey or Irma or Michael, where you're talking about the mother of all storms. And so, unless you build, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet higher, Mexico Beach was 8, 10 feet of storm surge? I mean, that's a really difficult situation. I would say, sort of to the broader question of what we can do. I think the National Flood Insurance Program has a model which works. I mean, David's point is well taken. I mean, it starts with you. It starts with the local communities. The federal government can't mandate the communities to do anything. You all are responsible for the local land use planning and codes. So, but what the NFIP did, and I mean, I had opportunity to go back and look at the original congressional findings and declarations for why is there a national flood insurance program, and it was essentially a trade or an exchange, a quid pro quo, and it went something like this. We will give you a carrot of subsidized insurance and flood maps and mitigation assistance in exchange for you building to a standard and adopting a regulation and code or ordinance. And so just sort of the basic structure of the flood program being that the federal government will offer assistance if communities do X, Y, and Z remains, I think, a model which could help facilitate. I mean, if the federal government were to look, and I mean, there's been recent reforms, Disaster Reform Relief Act, so there have been reforms in order to provide more disaster relief. There's, sort of a state deductible proposal that was sort of floated out there. I mean, if there was opportunities for the federal government beyond what they do today to say, look, we will offer you this carrot, X, Y, and Z, for you to build 2 feet above base flood, 3 feet, whatever it is. I mean, it seems to me that that partnership between local, states, and federal government, it has to begin there in order to try to address this issue. And so it seems to me that model is a very effective, and it's a model that we need to dust off, look at, and modernize, bring into the 21st century. And I think that's a way to proceed.